Hello again, I am Blunty, and that's the SJCam M20, SJCam's newest model from their line of action cams. And priced at under 120 Yankee Doodle dollars, it has a surprisingly attractive and extensive feature set. For one, it can record video at up to 2K resolution at 30 frames per second at 1080p at up to 60 frames per second. It does also have a 4K mode, but it's not true 4K, and I will come back to that a little bit later when I start showing you all the footage I took with it. And a feature particularly attractive to me, it's also got a gyro sensor, which it uses to digitally stabilize the video, making what would have been jittery footage into smoother, much more watchable video. And it uses one of Sony's image sensors, something that SJCam are particularly keen on letting you know right there on the box. Fair enough too. Sony do make superb image sensors, and if you got one of those in your camera, you might as well brag about it. In the box, you get quite a generous pile of various mounting options, something that in its own right makes it vastly better value than any GoPro out there, who are stunningly stingy when it comes to supplying mounting gear with their cameras. The case it comes in is waterproof down to 30 meters, but it also does come with an open-air cage-type case for it too, with Q20 tripod mounts top and bottom, and with a spring-loaded clip that can snap on the back, though doing so obscures the small but bright and clear 1.5-inch screen on the back. There's even built-in Wi-Fi for connecting to an app on your phone for remote control over it. Speaking of remote control, you can get one of those too. Physically, it's noticeably smaller than my GoPro and much lighter too. In most other respects, physically, it's similar to most cameras of this type. There's a power button, a shutter button, and two other buttons, all of which are used in reasonably intuitive combinations to navigate the basic UI, which gets you around all the settings you need. The screen on the back is actually vastly better than the last time I laid hands on an SJCam action cam. A few years back, the screen on that thing was terrible. This one though, outdoors it's bright and colourful and easily readable in most conditions. Even under the direct and brutal Australian sun, it remained very useful. So, in short, it's a small, light action cam with sensible controls, nice design, great price, and unusually superb feature set for something at this value. But all of that is pointless unless, of course, the video it captures is actually worth using. So let's take a look. In 1080p mode, you get a pretty decent picture. Colours reproduce well, and the auto white balance is well behaved and accurate enough. And white balance alongside of ISO and exposure compensation can also be manually set if you're after much more control over your exposure. I did, however, notice that the auto exposure tended towards letting the highlights blow out rather than crush the shadows in high contrast situations. And while I would have liked to see much wider dynamic range, this behaviour is usually more useful than losing all detail in the mids and lows while trying to preserve the highs, so that's fine. Contrast is very well handled, delivering a relatively punchy look without going overboard, but detail preservation is a bit disappointing, and it's not really the lens's fault either. Now, of course, as I said, Sony do make superb sensors, but it's how that information is processed that really is key to image quality. And here, the hardware doing the compression is just, well, it's too aggressive and not particularly good at reducing noise. Even in its highest quality setting, you'll still see comparatively minor but noticeable macro blocking, especially in tonal transitions, and in darker areas especially, there's a ton of random noise and pixel crawling, the kind of stuff you're usually more used to seeing in low light situations. This camera, by the way, is not very good at low light at all, but then again, I've yet to come across an action camera that is useful in low light situations. Now, for a camera at this price point, it is unlikely to be the first choice for someone making a quote-unquote serious production, so these kinds of issues really aren't all that important in the context of who this camera is for and where the footage is going to end up. There is also some rather ugly purple fringing on high contrast edges, pretty typical of all but the very, very, very best of the action cams out there, but it still does bug me. The gyro stabilization, however, works wonderfully well. Often, with digital stabilization, you'll get weird artifacting and an odd jello-like effect, and it just kind of is a bit ugly. But as you can see for yourself, on this camera, it works pretty damn well, leaving behind a smooth, clean, and fairly uncompromised image. The M20 can also take 16 megapixel still photographs. These two suffer the same issues as the video when it comes to noise and detail loss. But again, in the context of how these pictures will be used by most users, that's not really an issue because they'll be resizing them and posting them up on social media. So the image issues present here are not really anything anyone will ever even notice. There are various video resolutions and frame rates to choose from, 1080p in 30 or 60 frames per second. Both work well, but while the 30 frames per second option has a 22 megabits per second data rate, the 60 frames per second option doesn't double that. In fact, it only pushes it to 30 megabits per second, which means unless you really need 60 frames per second, you are better off image quality wise going for the 30 frames per second option. There's a slow rec mode, which produces a 720p file recorded at 60 frames per second but automatically flagged to play back at 30 frames per second for super easy straight out of the camera slow-mo. The VGA 240 frames per second mode is all but useless except for the novelty of super slow-mo because it just, well, it looks like that. 720p 120 frames per second is another option, and indeed the better option for pulling out more useful slow-motion shots from the camera. The flagship feature on the front of the box, the 2K mode, is actually, more technically, 2.5K. But I suppose someone in marketing said that 2K is something more consumers understand, while 2.5K is just all too confusing. It's always someone in marketing that does that crap. Whatever the reason, while 2K is technically 2048 pixels deep, this is 2650 pixels deep, or to put it in another somewhat friendlier frame of reference, 1440p. And it's actually pretty good, but again, the data rate caps out at 30 megabits per second, less than I would have liked for 1440p footage, but the result is clean enough and quite usable. And when scaled back down to 1080p in the editor, you actually get more detail preserved than the native 1080p option, so it's highly useful for that fact alone. The 4K option doesn't actually sample 4K's worth of pixels from the sensor. Instead, it's faked. It's an internally interpolated resolution from the 2.5K readout, with some sharpening applied over it, and it's at 24 frames per second and at about 24 megabits per second. The result isn't as super fantastic as true 4K can be, of course, and the sharpening is a bit on the aggressive side for my tastes. But again, it's pretty useful to have it there, and it is more useful scaling it back down to 2K or 1080p to help get a bit more detail than 1080p native does. There's also a wide dynamic range option in the menus, which is basically useless, as instead of preserving those blown out highlights as you might wish it did, it just kind of pulls the contrast back a bit from the shadows. You do get a little more detail in the shadows, the effect is noticeable, but not all that useful, frankly. Speaking of not all that useful, the field of view options, which I have to presume due to some weird glitch or fault in the current firmware, doesn't actually do a damn thing. Like, at all. And yes, I checked that I had it selected properly in the menu several times, but each time, zero change. The in-camera color modes are almost as perplexing, not least of which is the black and white option, which does nothing of the sort. It does drain away the color a little bit, but it's certainly not black and white, because here is what black and white actually looks like from what I'd done in my editor manually. I'd much rather fiddle with color casts in the editor anyway, where I have complete control. Distortion correction is yet another in-camera processing option with an incredibly subtle effect as well. Now, all action cams, thanks to their fisheye ultra-wide lenses, will have distortion, easily spotted when straight lines venture near the edges of frame. Distortion correction attempts to compensate for this by trying to straighten those lines back out again, but as you can see, or perhaps as you can't see, it's pretty friggin' subtle. It is, however, smart enough to only really bother applying the correction to the edges of the frame where the distortions are worse. In the end, it does help a little bit, and it doesn't seem to degrade any other aspect of the image, so you may as well leave it on. Another perplexing thing about this camera is, strangely enough, battery life seemed utterly unaffected regardless of which mode I was filming in, or even if I used the built-in screensaver option to black out the screen after a minute of filming. In 1080p, 30 frames per second, or 60 frames per second, in 2K, even 4K, I got an almost perfectly consistent 95 minutes of recording from a single battery charge. 95 minutes of 1080p at 60 frames per second took up about 20 gigabytes of card space. 95 minutes of 1080p at 30 frames per second took up about 16 gigabytes of card space. And 95 minutes of 4K 24 FPS took up about 16 gigabytes of card space also. So, I guess the story is, you'll get about 95 minutes regardless of what settings you use. Get yourself a nice 32 gigabyte card and one spare battery, and you're good for about 3 hours worth of filming, which seems pretty damn good to me. Recharge time, by the way, from dead to full is about 3 hours or so over USB. And there's even more little tricks it does that I didn't cover here, like a dash cam mode that automatically starts recording when power is applied via USB. And yes, you can power it via USB while you're filming normally as well. There's loop recording modes, also useful for that dash cam mode. You can even have it burn in your license plate number information on the footage alongside time and date. There's a time-lapse and even motion-activated modes too. The thing is overflowing with odd little tricks most action cameras just don't do at all. For a complete rundown of all the little bits and pieces in the feature list, there's a link to the SJCam site in my down below area, so take a poke around for yourself if you're curious. Now, speaking personally, the microphone on these action camera style things is never that vital to how I use the cameras. I tend to use them as sort of B-roll cameras to get that nice wide shot here and there, and either do a voiceover or use the audio from another camera and cut it in, all that kind of stuff. But for the sake of those of you who do like to use just the pure raw audio from the onboard mics of these action cameras, the reason I'm waffling about this crap is so you can have a nice long listen, because of course you are listening to me through the onboard mic. It will of course be, bloody hell, it's got dive bombed by a bird. Did you see that? It will cost me. Cheeky little bugger. Wonder what he wanted. I was saying something about the microphone quality. Oh right, you're listening to the microphone. It will be almost entirely muffled inside the waterproof case, of course, because that's how waterproof cases work. They have to be airtight. And sound is air moving. So yeah. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm in a little clip case thingamabobbledoodler, so you can hear the microphone in the best possible light. I'm just about to leave the shade. I have to put my glasses back on. That should be well long enough for you to get an idea about how this thing sounds anyway. Actually, just before we go, I suppose it's also worth showing you, as an ancillary to this review of the camera, the full extent of the selfie pole that they sell to go with it. And this is what you're looking at right now. My arm's sort of sloped out in front of you. You can probably see it. The lens is wide enough. You can see what kind of angle my arm is at. But as you can see, it's a nice, generous selfie pole, probably another 30 centimeters longer than most I'm familiar with. So yeah, you get really nice long shots. You can reach in over stuff, which is why I use the selfie pole. I don't use it for selfies at all. Usually it's a handheld monopod for me, and an arm-based boom or a jib for my camera work. Which is why I hate the word selfie stick, because it reduces the idea of the usefulness of such a device to selfies. That sort of egotistical, kind of narcissistic trend that's come out in the last sort of 5-7 years or so. It's been getting worse and worse and worse. But now I'm going on a rant about selfie sticks. You don't need to know that. The useful thing I'm trying to point out here is the usefulness of the sort of extra long handheld monopod that SJCam do sell alongside this camera, with the built-in little two-prong GoPro style mount for it. It's not a traditional sort of a tripod mount or a phone holder or stuff. Interesting enough though, in the box they do give you an adapter to put on top of this, so you can mount a regular tripod mounting style device to it as well. So you can use the handheld monopod for more than just this camera or a GoPro style mounted camera. That's nice. But yeah, that is the SJCam M20. It's not the best action camera you can own, but probably pretty easily one of the best action cameras you can own at this kind of price. The bang for buck value here is pretty impressive. Thanks for watching, I am Blunty, and I will catch you next time.